Hello guys and welcome to the second part of the texturing in Blender 2.8 video tutorial. I am the creator of the game called Snappy Mouse Run, and in the previous video we talked about what to consider when placing seams and unwrapped the UV map of the teapot. In this video we will talk about the UV editor and what to consider when manipulating the UV layout and finish it. Let's see how the mapping works with a concrete texture. In the UV editor, go to New, we will name it Test Grid and change the generated type to UV Grid. Zoom out with the mouse wheel. This will be our test texture. In the viewport, the active object is still the teapot and we are still in edit mode. Change the viewport shading to material and disable X-ray. We cannot see the texture in the viewport yet because the created texture is not assigned to the object's material automatically. Under the object's properties, go to materials tab. The teapot has only this one default material. The object's material determines how the object is going to be rendered, and the texture is only one of the many parts a material has. If you don't see these material options, maybe you are using a different render engine, so check under render tab that render engine is set either to Eevee or cycles. Back to material, our texture will be the material base color. Currently the base color is set to this white single color that can also be seen in the viewport. Click on the indicator next to the color and we want to get the base color from the image texture. Now select our test texture. The texture is now applied and visible in the viewport. Let me explain how the mapping works in the UV editor. Most of the keyboard shortcuts are the same as in the viewport. Press 3 to switch to face select mode and also make sure the UV sync selection is turned on in the UV editor. This means that the selection between the viewport and the UV editor is in sync. Okay, the mapping works like this. The texture that is drawn at the face position here will be projected onto the same face on the 3D mesh. For example, everything that is drawn onto the area this face covers will be drawn on the same face on the 3D surface here. The more area the face covers on the UV map, for example like this one, the more texture will be packed onto the same face on the surface here. So this means this face has more texture detail on it than, for example, this squeezed one here, although they are both approximately the same size on the actual surface. If we select those squeezed UV faces and try to scale them by pressing S, we see that they get more detail as they include more area in the UV editor. Vertices, edges and faces in the UV editor can be manipulated the same way as in the 3D viewport. The main difference is that the faces in the UV editor are not really connected to each other. If you try to select a face and move it, you will realize that it's not connected to the rest. You can create UV islands that way. Furthermore, if we switch back to vertex select mode and try to select only one vertex of the moved face, we see that also the one vertex from the main island gets selected as well. If we move it, both are moving. It's the same with edges. That's because every face gets unwrapped separately with its own vertices and edges, and this creates duplicates vertices and edges in the UV editor. Since the UV sync is turned on, selecting a vertex or edge in the UV editor select the same vertex or edge in the viewport, but the faces in the viewport are sharing their vertices and edges with other faces. So in order to keep the selection between the viewport and UV editor synchronized, all duplicated vertices and edges in the UV editor get selected as well. This makes manipulating the vertices in UV editor very hard with the UV sync enabled, although it may be useful from time to time. Let's undo this. Ctrl Z. We will manipulate the mapping with UV sync disabled so the duplicates don't get selected. With UV sync disabled, we can only manipulate UVs from faces that are selected in the viewport, like group of faces, with the rest hidden. However, in the UV editor, we can change the selection viewport independent and manipulate every vertex duplicate separately. Here the selection modes also have different icons from the ones in the viewport to make this more distinct. In addition to the standard vertex, edge and face selection mode, there is also an island selection mode, which is the same as selecting a vertex and selecting all connected by pressing Ctrl L. Editing with UV sync disabled works as someone would expect, so all the visible faces are behaving as if they are connected and as if they are no vertex or edge duplicates. I said as if because the sticky selection mode option glues all duplicates together and creates the illusion. The hidden faces are not affected by this and stay in place. If the UV editor seems a bit confusing, the easiest way to get started is to select all faces in the viewport, press A, make sure the UV sync is disabled and sticky selection mode is set to shared vertex. Okay, here the UVs are a bit rotated, let's correct them. This isn't really necessary, but it may help afterwards when we will edit the actual texture image. Press 1 to switch to vertex select, Alt select this loop here and Shift Alt select this loop here. Now let's make it horizontal. Usually we would scale it on the y-axis to 0 in order to make it horizontal, but there is another neat shortcut. Shift W and select align Y. Now let's pin it, press P. The vertices are pinned, and if we select everything and unwrap again, it unwrapped around the pinned vertices. Okay, we have identified earlier that most of the texture detail on the body will be painted on the sides. Go to the side view, press 3, select wireframe and turn on X-ray. Select those areas areas. That's where most of the detail is going to be drawn. But if we invert the selection in the viewport by pressing Ctrl I, we can see in the UV editor that most of the available area is covered by the rest of the faces. So with this setup, the currently selected faces would get all this space. Although there is not much detail to be painted on there, the important details that are painted on the sides would get only this small unselected area here. This can also be seen with the material shading enabled in the viewport. Also turn off X-ray and hide the reference images in the outliner. This is how the test texture looks like on the teapot. The texture is denser on the upper part. On the middle and lower parts it's somehow stretched. This means that those stretched parts will get less detail. The back handle and the front part are stretched even more. This stretching can also be visualized in the UV editor. Open the numbers panel, press N. Under View tab, Display Overlays, check Stretching. You can choose between Angle Preview, which shows you the angular distortion between UV and 3D angles, and Area Preview, which shows you the area distortion between UV and 3D faces. In both cases, blue means no stretching, red means a lot of stretching. So we see that the area is stretched almost everywhere. The goal is to minimize the stretching. An easy solution is to let Blender fix it for us. Select everything in the viewport and in the UV editor, go to UV and minimize stretch. It takes a while to apply it. When it's done, a small drop down should pop up in the UV editor. If you don't see it and there is a message in the status bar saying press plus and minus, just press enter. Open the minimize stretch drop down. In most cases we want fill holes to be checked and blend to be set to 0. Let's try to undo this step, Ctrl Z, and redo Ctrl Shift Z to see the difference. Overall it looks better. In the UV editor the area stretching has improved, the angle stretching looks a bit worse than before, but that is actually the best we can get with that many seams on this particular object. We will do texture painting afterwards, so as long as the stretching does not occur where most of the texture detail is going to be painted on, or it's not too severe, it's acceptable. The stretching is still visible here on the upper part. If a lot of detail is expected to be painted on there, then we would prior need to correct those parts by hand in the UV editor. Since that's not the case, we will leave it as is. However, if we would use a procedural texture, like this test texture that repeats itself, then this is definitely not very satisfying. In that case, we would need to add seams and repeat unwrapping until the stretching is acceptable or fully corrected. Since we will do texture painting afterwards and stretching does not affect parts with most of the details, we are good with this result. Now we also need to unwrap the top cover. The cover faces are currently hidden in edit mode. To show all hidden, press Alt H. The top cover will be unwrapped as a separate UV island. So let's make room for it. Select on the UV editor and scale down a bit and move it to the side. Now the question is, does the cover need to have seams in order to be unwrapped? If we want to let Blender decide this and unwrap it for us, then select any part of the top cover in the viewport, press Ctrl L to select all faces, go to UV and Smart UV Unwrap. We get something like this with a lot of seams and cuts. We don't want that. We don't want seams if we don't need them. Let's correct it. The most obvious would be to mark one seam around the bottom face, and that should be it. Alt select, Ctrl E, mark seam. Ctrl L to select all and UV Unwrap. Okay, let's try to correct the stretching on the tip. Make sure everything is selected in the UV editor. UV, minimize stretching, compare it with previous, Ctrl Z and redo, Ctrl Shift Z. It got worse here, where we expect some details to be painted on, but the tip got better. Since this part is more important than the tip, undo it, Ctrl Z, go again, UV, minimize stretching, and in the minimize stretching dropdown, set blend to around 0.5. Compare again, undo, redo, much better, no severe stretching. Okay, scale it down. Now select all in the viewport and rearrange the islands in the UV editor. Use the island selection mode, make sure proportional editing is off, select an island and press G to move. Just to make sure the islands are in proportion, select all, go to UV and average island scale. We want them to be in the right proportion to each other and arrange them so they cover as much of the canvas as possible. Also, we don't want them to overlap. Okay, go to object mode in the viewport. This is how our test texture looks like on the teapot. As mentioned, some stretching is still going on here, but after the texture painting, it will not be noticeable. That's it for this video. In the next video, we will extract the texture from the reference images and paint it on the teapot. Thank you very much for watching. Give a like and subscribe if you found this video useful and want to see more content like this, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.